Greetings, Guardians, my name is Bife here. We're not completely done with the Season of the Wish content, but I wanted to take a moment to stop and think about what happens next. We know at very least that we'll be receiving 3 episodes after the final shape, but we also know that the universe and the system are likely to be changed forever. For the longest time, we've had to face up against enemies that have loyally served the Witness and its disciples. But now, as the dust settles and the Season of the Wish enters a slower period, we can start to assess some of the challenges that might arise after the final shape. The big one, as I see it, is this: who will replace the Witness? You've all probably heard me use the phrase power vacuum on this channel before, but now we're at the stage where multiple power vacuums are suddenly presenting themselves across a multitude of frontiers and enemy factions. There are also those who might potentially fill those vacant spaces as the commanders of certain forces, some of them for ill, some of them for good. Today we're going to talk more about each of them. But first, are you looking to get a new gaming PC without the hassle of assembling one for yourself? If so, then the sponsors of this video, Starforge, might be able to help you. They've got a range of hand-built PCs that all come with a 2-year parts and labor warranty. Whether you're looking for a budget PC or a top-of-the-line content creator rig, you are all set with Starforge. Check my link in the description to get a discount on your purchase. And thank you again to Starforge for sponsoring this video. So, let's start by talking about what the Witness would leave ungoverned if it somehow was removed from the calculus of war, in the event of our victory in the final shape. What does a world without the Witness look like? As I see it, we need to look at the influence it had over every different faction in Sol. With this in mind, I think we need to examine some more closely than others, but it is worth taking a look at all of them. So we'll break them down into the Hive, Taken, Scorn, Elixni, Vex, Cabal, and Scions. Each of these factions will be impacted by the Witness's departure, and in some instances, it will present a power vacuum. There will be some who will definitely step up to fill that power vacuum, and in those instances where it's not obvious who will, sometimes there will be multiple successors. In those instances, I would call it a contested faction. These contested factions will very much be a key emphasis of the story in the future, so I wanted to highlight them now. And it's also worth remembering that if there isn't a contest, and if someone does just step straight into the breach, that's maybe going to be a problem for us as well, because if there is now a united leader to a faction, and they happen to be opposed to us, we have a new enemy to worry about. It's also worth reminding everyone that some factions are going to be impacted a lot more by the departure of the Witness than others. Some will simply be affected by its departure as a sort of proxy, where its minions and disciples fall away, so will any controlling influence over them, and this frees them up to do a whole lot more. Some will be intimately and directly wound into the Witness's influence, and so we should probably start with one group that fits that description pretty well: the Hive. With the failure to resurrect Oryx in the Season of the Deep, the return of Savathun at the end of the Season of the Witch, and the subsequent banishment of Xivu Arath from her own throne world, the Hive have never found themselves in such turbulent times. This is perhaps a little meandering from the topic, but it really shows how reliant the Hive are on their leaders as a force. The slow degradation of Crota's spawn on the moon after his demise, and the instinct of the Lucent Hive commanders to resurrect the Taken King as a light-bearer show us that regardless of whether they're aligned to the light or dark, the Hive seek and perhaps need strong leadership. At this moment in time, titanic shifts in the power and stability of these leaders is starting to present a possibility of dramatic change in the future. Whether this leads to entirely new leaders arising, or whether it brings about consolidation of power under a single leader, is yet to be seen, but the opportunity for it is certainly there. The two current controlling powers are undoubtedly the Warring Sisters, Xivu Arath and Savathun. Xivu's power is significantly weakened after her aforementioned banishment by Eris Morn. The process of this banishment rendered the Hive God of War mortal for the first time in millennia, a moment that echoes across the Ascendant Plane still, with the resulting aftermath of such a brutal banishment. Xivu Arath's own screams were but the predecessor to the changes that would follow on from this. This breaking of Xivu's immortality has apparently broken her vice-like grip over the Taken. Whilst the Witness had effectively gifted her command of this fearsome force, and whilst we'll talk more about them in a bit, this does also impact Xivu's standing Hive forces, who will have no further support from their darkness-exalted allies. The most ambitious Hive amongst her ranks may even seek to challenge her, though whether they'll be successful is unknown. What's unclear at the moment is the fate of the Wrathborn. Previously, these shock troops were loyal to Xivu Arath unswervingly, and were the result of many different races having been enthralled to her will by her cryptoliths that seed corruption across many worlds. It's unclear if she can call on these forces now that her influence is significantly diminished, but I have to imagine that her grip, much like that on the Taken, has loosened. Xivu represented the Witness's greatest remaining general in the conflict of light and dark, but after her humbling, she has seen her brood's coordination fall apart in a dramatic fashion. Her forces are in a dramatically weaker position. Savathun, on the other hand, has freshly returned and is looking to be in a relatively strong position, but is still a clear competitor to Xivu Arath. Her return has prevented the Lucent Hive from being completely routed, and has allowed her to reorganize. Whilst the Lucent brood under Immaru and in the hands of any Hive commanders has always been deadlier than their counterparts, I think it's also a fair analysis to say that with them being a minority of the Hive numerically, their force projection ability is much smaller. Xivu's broods were able to pull from many other subsequent abandoned broods across Sol, including the disparate forces of the Hive on the Moon or, say, on Titan. Any mainstream darkness-aligned Hive, which doubtless has to be the majority of them, would likely have aligned with Xivu Arath. Now Savathun has been able to claim some broods to her advantage, namely the brood of Nokris, formerly from Mars, as well as some of Oryx's old commanders, such as Ekthar. It's likely that she's pulled at least some of the brood from the Dreadnought, but this still puts her at a clear numerical minority. With that being said, Savathun's return and her place as the more ascendant of the two sisters has surely galvanized her Hive forces and has probably helped to keep them focused and organized. This organizational advantage can be a major point in favor of the Lucent Brood, given that they can pursue tactical objectives with a more concentrated strategy. The Lucent Brood's numbers are also offset by two major benefits that they uniquely maintain. First of all, their leader Savathun has a form of further enhanced immortality compared to any other Hive god in history. Not only does she have a throne world, as is typical, but she also has a ghost, meaning that she'd need to be defeated in her own throne world, in the seat of her own power, and then Immaru would also need to be killed. This level of resilience is unmatched, and is backed up by Savathun's ability to plan around potential outcomes in a manner that guarantees her advantage. Secondly, there is the wider force of the Lucent Hive Lightbearers, who represent a significantly more powerful set of opponents on the battlefield than most other Hive. Only the strongest of darkness-aligned Ascendant Hive might hope to challenge a Hive Lightbearer and survive. What's more troubling about them is that as time goes on, they may continue to grow in number, as more ghosts may find their way to the Lucent Hive. These Lightbearers that do choose to serve Savathun will only grow in strength themselves, as they will, over time, garner more experience in the field. The two factions are both potentially going to be leaders of the contested Hive, but I think it'd be more accurate to state that the Hive now are forever split down the middle, with Xivu's dark-aligned Hive and Savathun's Lucent Brood simply never finding any hope of reuniting. I could of course be wrong. Maybe the death of the Witness will allow an opening for Xivu Arath and Savathun to combine their forces. But in the midst of all of this, the Hive are not simply ruled by the sisters alone. There are other third parties who might be able to exert a strange kind of influence if they can find footing. In moments like this, I can't help but think of the Worm Gods and their take on all of this. They have to have some opinion on the Witness, and if the Witness does die, the immortality and the ways of the deep that they have always espoused and always clung to might now suddenly be in jeopardy. I also can't help but think of Toland, the Shattered One. Any interaction between Toland and the Hive isn't guaranteed to go well, but it is entirely possible that with the lack of the witness to drive them, and with Toland having a great grasp of both the sword logic and the power of darkness, they might see fit to make him some kind of new overruling influence in their ranks. Toland has openly stated that he would seek power of this nature if it was made available to him. He has asked us previously, near the time of Oryx's death, if a vacancy might open, to simply let him know. This vacancy that he looks for is, well, the power vacuum. And Xivu Arath and Savathun may have a competitor in Toland the Shattered, if they are not careful. The Hive will be in turmoil for a while, with many broods being leaderless and lacking true direction. And that makes them the first real victim of the death of the Witness, and it makes them our first real focus of a power vacuum conflict. So, the Taken are in a strange place, and it's right that we discuss them after we've discussed the Hive, because the two are often seen as intrinsically linked. For as long as the Hive have been called the Hive, they have served the Witness in one way or another, either knowingly or unknowingly. Since Aurix descended into the deep and became Oryx, the Taken King, the Hive have been able to make use of the Witness's greatest forces. The creation of the Taken is contingent on a being of immense power being able to corrupt another being with that power of darkness, and hollow them out into an obedient servant. This seemingly can only be the Witness, meaning that if it is defeated, there may at some point come a day when the Taken cease to exist. But in the meantime, there's a problem, and that's that the Taken can still be controlled by anyone with a strong enough will that they can impose on others. The problem with this is that such a form of control can come from almost any place imaginable as best we know. It's not guaranteed, but the control of the Taken does not need to be someone who is aligned with the Hive. The Nine have been able to supposedly impose their will on at least a fraction of the Taken. Xivu Arath previously commanded them, and might do so again if her power ever reaches a point of resurgence. The disciples of the Witness, such as Rolk, have often been gifted Taken forces as shock troops and powerful defenders. But these are only the likely suspects who might attempt to take control of the Taken swarm. Other newcomers have seen that the Witness is absent, and that this force of terrifying, absolutely loyal soldiers is looking for only one thing: a mind strong enough to command them. There's the potential for the resurgent Ahamkara to take control of the Taken, should they so choose. There are wild and unknown actors in the universe, such as the aforementioned Toland the Shattered, who would probably salivate at the chance to control such a powerful force of shock troops. And lastly, perhaps most worryingly of all, Mara Sov herself has experimented with the idea of controlling the Taken, having already attempted to take control of an isolated Taken within the Confluence. Amongst all this, there is a single consistent thread. If someone with strong enough will does rise to take control of the Taken, either in part or in their entirety, they will become one of the most powerful forces in the system, and there is no guarantee that they will be on our side. The Taken cannot be seen as an appendage of the Hive's control as they would have been nearly a decade ago. They are now their own entity, and they are even more reliant on their leaders than the Hive are. The lack of a true ruler of the Taken means that they represent one of the most important power vacuums after the final shape has played out, and a race to control the Taken will likely be the best known arm race in the system as time goes on. I imagine that that story will be building in the background, and there will be multiple individuals seeking dominion over this dark army. In a strange way, the Scorn are a sort of similar story to the Taken, but there is one major difference. The Scorn seem to be evolving. Much like their Taken counterparts, they are often seen as just tools, subject to the whims of those with the willpower to exert control over them. For the most part, this is correct. When the Scorn are created by reanimating a fallen with dark ether, they can be effectively controlled by entities such as the Witness. However, there is a differentiating factor for the Scorn on top of all this, which is that whilst many of them can be forced into subservience, The most powerful amongst them are capable of learning, belief, desires, and their own independent thoughts. No better example of this exists than Fikrul, the fanatic, the one who is believed to be the most powerful Scorn at this moment in time, and likely immortal, maybe even invincible. He is clearly aligned against the powers of the Coalition and is intent on creating his own faction of Scorn as best we know, a faction capable of self-governance. In many ways, this would make Fikrul the prime candidate to take control of the Scorn and dominate the power vacuum that has been left open by the Witness's departure. However, the Scorn's susceptibility to outside control by any powerful paracausal force means that Fikrul will always be fighting off rivals, and it makes the Scorn vulnerable to greater powers throughout the system and beyond. Even as recently as with Warlord's Ruin, we saw Fikrul sending his 5 knights to bring the Scorn within the ruin under Fikrul's control. Unfortunately, these knights became enslaved to the greater will of the remains of an Ahamkara. The Scorn have good reason to fear the majority of paracausal forces within the system, and will likely be fighting for their own independence for some time. Until control of their broods is properly settled, I believe it'll be likely that the Scorn will represent a persistent power vacuum waiting for someone to topple the Fanatic's control. This is, unless the Fanatic is able to increase his own power to as yet unseen heights, in which case the prospect of a unified Scorn is within reach, and their danger will only become more pronounced. By far the most hopeful story ahead of all of this is that of the Eliksni. The Eliksni have existed in a strange state that might best be described as stagnation for a long time. That's not the hopeful part of the story. The hopeful part is all to do with the forces that are now unifying within the system, and who at present is their unifier. Previously, we had 3 major factions amongst the Eliksni forces in the system. The House of Salvation with their well-integrated military-industrial base on Europa and their ties to the Witness. The House of Dusk and their disorganized but numerically superior troop numbers. And the House of Light, who were small in number but held the authority of a Kell who had bested Eramis personally in combat, and who had allied himself with the Coalition and settled beneath the Great Machine once again. There may have been 3 remaining houses, but realistically there were only 2 remaining Kells, Eramis and Mithrax. That's all changed as of late. Eramis has decided to leave the system in search of her mate, Arthras. The Eliksni are now experiencing a unique position where there is only one power capable of consolidating them, the House of Light. Now, it'd be foolish to state that Eramis's departure would stop all piracy in the system or create a universal appetite for peace, but it does leave a significant power vacuum for Mithrax to exploit personally. He is now in a position to muster any Eliksni that might be willing to follow him, which isn't a prospect that's too hard to imagine. Joining the House of Light willingly would be a pretty poor demotion for any successful Eliksni pirate captain who might have their own ketch or even just a skiff. But for any member of their crews, I have to believe that it's a tempting prospect. For their loyalty, they would receive a place to call home, the safety behind the Lost City's walls and the Coalition's fleets, and the promise of an end to the practice of docking, which in this instance means cutting off the lower 2 arms of the Eliksni. It's all a tempting prospect. If there is one guiding light for the Eliksni, one hope for this, it's that the power vacuum will not be filled by a dangerous figure, but instead by a powerful ally that we can call upon in future conflicts. As time goes on, Mithrax and his people will become more and more entrenched in the fabric of the Lost City, which makes his place as the potential leader of his people even more important to us personally. With their integration comes a time of peace and prosperity, as well as some inevitable cultural tension between the 2 formerly warring peoples of humanity of Earth and the Fallen, as we would put them. However, this may eventually subside, and if they do eventually live alongside each other in peace, maybe the Eliksni will become our most powerful ally of all. If the Eliksni power gap is to be occupied by foes of some kind, it will likely be a new upstart warlord. There are dozens of Eliksni captains with authority over large enough groups that they might be able to control their whole species in their own minds, but most of these upstarts tend to have poor staying power and are more flashes in the pan rather than true unifiers. As it stands, there is a huge power vacuum, like there has always persistently been, but the Eliksni now have something that they have always lacked: a unifying vision that might genuinely bring them all together. Not one that will send their people to war, but one that will instead bring them closer to prosperity and will allow them to turn their swords back into plowshares. This is the vision of the House of Light, and this is how Mithrax might try and fill the power vacuum. Next, we need to talk about the most complex group by far, and that's the Vex. It's odd because the Vex in themselves don't really lose any power with the Witness's retreat. What they lose instead are either rivals in the majority of cases, or in the one case of the Sol Divisive, a potential path to victory. Simply put, the Vex are always going to be a hard group to discuss because they're the inevitable causal menace of the universe. They're perpetually trying to calculate a universe in which they are victorious at the end of time and have outlived or outgunned everything else. Their perpetual problem is that they haven't been able to find a solution for the paracausal forces of the universe, aka the light and the dark. The Vex have been trying to solve for this for years, and at great cost, they have shown the capacity to overcome this boundary before in very limited instances. The Vault of Glass was able to form a sort of causal challenge to isolated guardians within its control over time and space, although the real effectiveness of this was put into stark contrast when the Taken King arrived in the system and the Vault was completely overrun with Taken, who were able to sidestep and overwhelm the forces of the Hazen Defensive. The Vex of the Sol Divisive have been perpetually attempting to bond themselves to the Witness and its forces of darkness. They have been somewhat successful, and yet also have not achieved their true aim. The Witness uses them as some of its forces, but it does not truly consider them integrated parts of its own hierarchy. And last but not least, I think, the Mercurial Vex of the Infinite Forest have been using their vast simulation engines within Mercury to create minds and constructs capable of countering paracausal forces. The notable examples of these constructs include Panoptes, which was capable of simulating a successful sequence of events for the Vex to succeed at the end of time, and Agioctus, the Martyr Mind, who was responsible for specifically siphoning the light of a single paracausal entity, Saint 14. It is, however, worth remembering that at current Mercury is still unaccounted for, and, as best we know, the Mercurial Vex have been folded into the abducted realm of the Witness. The status quo on their power and their ability to respond is therefore hard to quantify. But how then does the Witness's removal from the situation assist or change things for the Vex? Well, that depends on which subtype you're talking about. For the vast majority of the Vex, this will be a victory and a broadening of their ability to further their influence. The removal of any paracausal force for the majority of the Vex removes a series of possible timelines in which they have fallen prey to its overwhelming power. If the Witness is to be defeated with the final shape, the Vex suddenly have a chance to push into territories in which the Witness was previously suppressing their actions. I think it's worth remembering what Osiris discovered. When we had destroyed the last version of the Undying Mind, all of the Vex within the Infinite Forest predicted a ruinous and calamitous situation where Earth was completely overrun by the Witness's forces and the Traveler was defeated. This may not come to pass, it might still come to pass. Regardless of what happens, if the Witness is removed from the picture, it is unlikely that those calculations will remain the same. For the Vex of the Sol Divisive, I imagine that the death of the Witness will be a strange time indeed, and there will be adaptation required. That's principally because of the one behavior that they have learned whilst attempting to bond themselves to a power that they could only understand in a religious context, and that one behavior is faith. The Vex of the Sol Divisive might be about to lose their god, if the Witness truly does cease to exist in the conclusion of the final shape. With that in mind, I truly have no idea how the Vex of the Sol Divisive are going to react. Their learned behavior of faith might kick in and cause them to experience a period of practiced mourning. Given the previous existence of the Undying Mind in the Black Garden and how it attempted to allow the recreation of the Black Garden's heart, I think it's entirely possible that we might see the Vex attempt to resurrect the Witness. This would doubtless be an extreme course of action, and I doubt that the Vex would truly succeed, which makes me then ponder if they might actually act differently from this. If the Sol Divisive do still have the same brutal calculus of survival at their heart that all Vex do, it might mean that when the Witness is truly defeated and made powerless, that the Vex would see it accordingly. Powerless. Not worth binding to. The Vex of the Sol Divisive have been in the Witness's thrall for a long time, but with the death of the Witness, they might just abandon its cause entirely, perceiving its weakness as a good enough excuse to decouple. Then again, they have tasted a degree of paracausal power, and they have been close to binding themselves to darkness. Even if they haven't succeeded, they might still see this as a viable route, even if the Witness has been removed from the picture. Stepping into the real-world context of it all, we do know that Bungie's first episode, following the final shape, will launch soon after it's released, and it is called Echoes. We know that Echoes is meant to center on the Vex and their story after the final shape, and from my perspective, the name Echoes implies a story that involves the various people who have been trapped inside the Vex network for all these years. If these people are the source of the so-called Echoes, or are what's being referenced with that name, we may see a different part of the story being impacted. This is all a bit of an aside when we're discussing power vacuums though, so to keep things focused, I think the big problem with the Vex is that they don't have a true intergroup power struggle in the way that we might understand. The Vex are too efficient for that. Instead, they're a constant threat to the whole universe. The sudden disappearance of the Witness doesn't mean that the Vex's commanders are going to be threatened. It does mean, potentially, that the Vex will move to become more threatening in turn. This is the scary thing about the Vex. They will and have historically moved to fill any power gap perceived. Take a look at the unsuccessful invasion of Oryx's throne world back in the Books of Sorrow, and you'll see that when the Vex perceive weakness, they exploit it, regardless of where that weakness is and whether it might be a good idea at the time. The problem then isn't that the Vex have a power gap within their own hierarchy to fill, it's that they're likely to exploit the wider power gap left by the Witness's departure to become a greater threat to the system at large. If this does happen, I expect we'll see many more threatening Vex incursions across our worlds, with the aim of their inevitable final victory. Next, we should talk about the Cabal, but this is really only going to be a brief little section. The reason for it being brief is that the Cabal's power vacuum problems are mostly already solving themselves. This is principally because Emperor Callus is dead, and Empress Keitel is the last remaining figure with any real degree of authority over the Cabal people. Now, I can hear some of you stating the obvious. The Cabal Shadow Legion on Neomuna still exists, and still exerts its own force. That is mostly true, but I think there's a strong case to be made for them not necessarily being seen as true Cabal anymore. I don't mean to say this as a means of partitioning them out as a factor that would make this an easier video topic to discuss. I'm doing this because even the other Cabal see the Shadow Legion as different. Observations of the Shadow Legion by Keitel's own forces show that the majority of the Shadow Legion are clones, created with the express purpose of serving Callus and the Witness. What little cultural references they do display seem to exalt the sword logic as displayed by the Hive and the final shape of the Witness, but have next to nothing to do with real Cabal culture. Callus might have held onto the vestiges of opulence that we know him for, but it's clear that aside from the gold on their armor, his Shadow Legion troops didn't really know anything of true opulence, and probably didn't care about it either. The Shadow Legion is still a threat, but without a leader in the immediate future, their ability to pose a system-wide challenge to anyone is severely limited. In time, their numbers will be thinned to the point of being destroyed entirely, so I believe that they are unlikely to pose a further threat to anyone at any point soon. They will need to be controlled on Neomuna, but ultimately they are not a factor to the rest of the Cabal. This isn't to say that Keitel will have no issues as she rises to control the whole of the remaining Cabal. There are still rogue Red Legion detachments that haven't folded themselves into her sphere of influence just yet, too busy fighting on Earth or turning into mercenaries. These detachments still patrol Earth, Nessus, and many other territories throughout the system, but their reunification with Keitel is still important for the Cabal's future. Ultimately, there is no real leader who can challenge Keitel, and this means that she will likely fill whatever power vacuum was left by her father. Her own true power is unlikely to change with this, though, as she is unlikely to gain any new forces from her father's defeat, or from the Witness's death. There is a big challenge to her authority, though, and that's where I want to talk about the last and most nebulous aspect of this video. Not sure how many of you expected it, but we are adding a separate section for the Scions. The Scions, at one point during the Witch Queen's greater expansion, had an entire exotic mission dedicated to them, called Vox Obscura. It was a mission centered around the idea of the distinct Scion culture, and how they were all looking to achieve independence from the Cabal Empire as a whole under Keitel. This was, however, mixed with the fact that many of them had chosen to close ranks with Emperor Callus, so ultimately it was a part of the wider conflict that led up to Lightfall. The reason why they represent a challenge to Keitel is because Scion traitors within the ranks of the Cabal are hard to detect and can go incognito for years without being rooted out. The Captain's Log lawbook, which follows the history of the Glykon, aka the Presage mission, shows us several interactions where Scions appear to be working together under different organizations of Cabal, and they are working together to achieve a wider goal across many of these different factions. Whether this is simply Euryx's group of Scion rebels that followed Callus, or whether this is a wider assortment of Scion forces that might cut to the heart of every single Cabal force across space, is unknown. I think that whilst there are some Scions who will be loyal to the Coalition, I believe that there are some others who will be fiercely hostile to it, although it's hard to account for if any of them have survived. For example, if Amtek, the Scion Flayer sister who attempted to crash the Almighty into Earth, is still out there, you can absolutely count them amongst the Scion rebels. Euryx might also be in alliance with her. If they share the animosity for the Vanguard and the forces of Keitel's ascendancy, they would make natural allies. If this unified Scion resistance does truly exist, then it is perhaps the one force that could challenge Keitel. But this force of Scions wouldn't necessarily be looking to depose Keitel and take her place. Instead, I imagine their goals would simply fall under the simpler banners of either complete Scion unification and independence, or vengeance against the Cabal Empire as a whole. Even though Keitel's first decree as Empress was that the Scions were to be made free and equal citizens of the Empire, such a singular act does not wipe away an entire history of oppression that the Scions have endured. As a result, I think it would be fair to say that the greatest challenge to the Cabal and their greatest competitor in the immediate future, as they attempt to reunify ahead of an inevitable war with Xivu Arath, will be the Scion rebel forces. If they still exist in the wake of the Witness's demise, they will have their own demands, they will have their own agenda, and they will be looking to strike back at all those that they perceive as enemies. If the Witness is defeated, they might see yet another instance where the light has taken a moment to strike out and defeat a force that could have given them some form of divinity, clarity, and purpose. Who knows, but I think it's wise to remember the Scion rebels. No matter how you look at it, the death of the Witness will be an event that sends shockwaves through the universe. Whilst there will no doubt be time for celebration after the defeat of the Witness, I imagine it'll take no time at all for military leaders to start to redraw the lines of battle and to understand that the future conflicts of Sol and beyond are about to begin. Hive gods, sovereigns, vast intelligences, clandestine rebel groups, all of them have the potential to benefit from the power vacuum left by the death of the Witness. But if there is a force that arises to exploit the death of the Witness generally, there are a few I'd watch in particular. Savathun's Lucent Brood are now in a more unified position than almost any other force within the system, and Savathun's long-running plots doubtless factor in this moment when the Witness dies and leaves many opportunities for the taking. The fanatic Fikrul will likely see further opportunities for resurgence as the Witness's hold over the Scorn is lost for good. If he can unify his forces and become more powerful so that he can stave off challengers, a vast army awaits him, and he will simply need the coordination to take it, hold it, and unify it to become one of the major players in Sol. Mithrax may be the sole unifying force for the Eliksni left in our system, and may be one of their last remaining chances to prosper and one day form a force strong enough to retake their homeworld, or simply to settle in peace, for the first true time in their history since the Whirlwind. The Vex of the Sol Divisive are at current unpredictable and a wild card. They will need to be watched keenly if the Witness should be defeated. The greater threat of the Vex overwhelming the battered and beleaguered forces of Sol is something that we should also all be aware of. And finally, I think it would be foolish to not once again mention the actions of Mara Sov, the Queen of the Awoken, who has not only sworn that she will watch over the new brood of Ahamkara that Riven and Taranis gave birth to, but also has now tested her will and is toying with the idea of controlling the Taken in the absence of the Witness. All these factions present the potential for conflict. There may be a brief moment of peace in Sol after the Witness's death, but I fear that that potential for conflict will immediately blossom when that power vacuum presents itself. This peace will come, but it will be brief, and I do not believe it is meant to last. Not yet. But that's all from me for now. If you enjoyed the video, go ahead and let me know by leaving a like. This was a long script, and honestly I'm very happy that I got to work on it. It's a fun idea for the video because it talks about where the future of everything goes, and it involves some genuine calculation. So, if you did enjoy it or have thoughts of your own, leave a like and leave a comment down below in the comments section. If you want to see where all of this does go in the future, remember to hit subscribe and the bell next to subscribe to turn on those email notifications. But as per usual, know that your viewership, as always, is quite enough for me. And that in the meantime, my name is Bife. Perodacia ad Astra. I'll see you starside.